O Heavenly King, Comforter of the Spirit of Truth, Lord, everywhere present and fill us all things, treasure of blessings and giver of life. Come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity and save our souls, O good Lord. Amen. Ah!
That's my problem.
Next, good to see you.
Yes, we're striking along.
Hey, that's good to see you.
And we're just talking to Father Patrick. So
Oh, how's he doing?
he's doing good. He's home.
Okay, no, that's good.
He's getting stronger every day. So it's,
Good. Yeah, is there any paralysis or any residual?
nothing.
Oh,
They gave him something to dissolve the blood clot and completely dissolved within an hour.
well,
They
thank
got
God.
him to the ER in time, and
Mhm.
miracle. I mean,
Was it a stroke or a TIA?
yeah, it was. Well, I think it was a stroke, but I don't know.
Okay. Well. Okay. So, last time we met, I gave you some homework. Did anybody do their homework?
I did.
You did?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
If it is the same homework.
Did anybody else do any homework?
I didn't know the assignment
Someone
sheet.
forgot.
In your last
Was that on the
I think it's
homework?
read Ephesians and Colossians.
Did y'all get your food? Ate your homework?
Oh, was it reading Ephesians and Colossians? Was it?
Yeah, it was Ephesians.
Oh
do it
no,
now.
I stand correct about it. That was not the homework I did.
Uh-huh.
Which one did you do?
It was the book.
Ah,
that he
the
asked
book
us to read.
that I couldn't read. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. That was the time before.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
So I missed that class.
Well,
I did too.
Say no excuse. Yeah.
okay, well, that's all. We'll actually get to that stuff later on, but I would encourage you all to read Ephesians and Colossians, and the first chapters, and compare them, and get to know them well enough, and then if you can, if you have, and there may still be copies downstairs for sale. There's a bilingual edition of the Liturgy, or
I got that at Jordanville.
you got it, Jordanville.
Yeah.
Okay. If you have a copy of the Liturgy, and especially the Liturgy of St. Basil, to read through the anaphora prayers. But we'll go through that all eventually in more detail. So we've talked about the kind of basic structure of the liturgy. We talked about the structure of the church. How there was a place for the proscomedia, for the preparation of the gifts, in a separate in ancient times in a separate building called the Scepophylakia. But the proscomedia was also part. Of course, it was where the gifts for the Eucharist were prepared. But it's where people brought their offerings, especially of loaves of bread. And you see still in Greek churches, in particular Arab churches too, where people will bring they'll make loaves of prosphora, altar bread, with the stamp and the whole bit. And but the idea is the priest would choose one or several of those loaves to use, and then the rest would be distributed to the poor. And of course, now we don't do so much the distribution to the poor. We have there's the distribution of antiteron at the end of the liturgy, and then there's the Russian custom of the little prosphorettes, which are evidently they go quick, right? Yeah, you have to mob the desk and back to get your little prosphoras.
Yeah, they do.
They don't use that in the Greek church.
No, they don't.
No,
And
Romanian.
neither other Orthodox churches. Like
No, that's a Russian. It's a
just
Russian
Russian.
custom.
They need something material all the time.
Yeah,
And Wojciech, how about the Coptic? Because they have even for the like.
it's a different tradition.
Yeah, very different because they have different loaves that they choose from during the service.
Yeah.
Like big loaves.
Yeah, the Greek loaves tend to be large too.
Yeah. The Coptic, they have like 5, and part of the service ritual is they're telling the prayers, and there is the chanting, and then the priest lifts each one of them, and then from those 5 he selects one, and that becomes the lamb.
Well, it's kind of interesting because eventually you get the feel for whether the bread is cooked all the way through, whether it has a big bubble underneath, right in the middle, which sometimes it does. Sometimes you cut into it and the seal falls off. There's all sorts of...
So it is like symbolically, because I asked them, why do you do that? They said, well, it's symbolic of seeking for the purest and the unblemished lamb, the ultimate sacrifice.
Right. In other words, the loaf of bread that's going to work the best.
Exactly.
Which has the clearest seal, and
What happens like if like in the other traditions they only have one and then that happens? What do you do?
Well, in Greek, with a lot of the Greek loaves, there are actually 3 seals. Okay. And so you cut the lamb out of one of the others. Okay. And the 3 seals, one of them, that also works for Lent, where you have 2 lambs for the pre-sanctified. But you basically need to have the seal, the ICXC and IKA, Jesus Christ the victor, on top of the lamb. And if all else fails and you don't have specially made prosphora, or the prosphora, no seal came out and you're stuck, you take the spear and you trace the seal onto the bread, into the crust. There's all sorts of ways of doing it. But the point is that for the offering, you have pure bread and pure wine. Pure bread meaning it's flour, water, salt, and yeast, nothing else. There's no, there's stories of some people deciding they want to improve the prosphora, so they add eggs and milk and butter, and then pretty soon it's more of a cake than it is. No, it just needs to be plain leavened bread, and there are certain ways that the prosphora is made, and in the Russian Church, the idea is the loaf is very dense and very thick, so thick and so dense that it doesn't crumb when you cut it, that it preserves its shape exactly, and it's solid. And that comes from you let it rise, and then but then you knead it for 20 minutes at least, preferably by hand, otherwise with a machine. But it takes that kneading to knock all of the air out of it, and then you put it in the oven before you shape it and stamp it and put it in the oven before it has a chance to rise again.
And they cut it in half too. When they assemble
No. When they make prosphora, this is the Russian tradition. It's in 2 parts. They make a base, and then there's a second layer, which has the stamp put on it. You've all seen the prosphora stamp, right? Okay. No?
No, I've said yeah.
Yeah. So I've seen the stamp, and so the stamp is impressed into what will become the top layer, and then with you wet the surface of the bottom layer, and you put the top on it, and then it's you take a toothpick or something like that, and you punch holes.
4.
Well, sometimes more, depending on
the size.
Just on the size. Basically, you don't want to have air pockets, because if there's air pockets, it's a problem. and so you end up with or if the seal comes off, that's a problem. Or the top, the top, you don't want a piece of prosper that's that thick. You probably, for a large church like this, it's that high and that big around. The Greek loaves, with the multiple images on the seal, they're that big around, and sometimes that thick, and they can be this big around as well, depending on how many communicants you're expecting. There are also, of course, chalices and stuff to fit the size. I've got one chalice. I've got it basically holds about a quarter cup of wine, and others will hold 4 bottles of wine.
Wow.
Of course, it takes 2 deacons to lift it, and it's huge.
Wow.
And that tall, that big around, and it would have handles on the side. Of course, you don't generally commune from a chalice that size. Everything is ladled out of it. In the Russian Church, there's the tradition, or there's a practice that's now being done. Instead of consecrating just one chalice and then ladling everything out into other smaller chalices, is that you consecrate a bunch of chalices all at the same time.
Is that still just as acceptable as?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And one of the big issues in the liturgy and there's been thank God a change, a transformation in the piety, is that people used to go to communion very, very infrequently, just a couple times a year maybe. So during Great Lent, at some point they would take the fast very seriously. They would fast for an entire week, and they would read all the prayers and go to confession and go to communion probably on a Saturday, and that would be it. And then maybe on their name's day, but usually during Lent, maybe during Christmas Lent, or maybe for the Mother of God, but a couple times a year. And then many would feel free to disregard the feasts and the fasts and the preparation for communion and all of the rest of the stuff the rest of the year. And that's bad practice.
I witnessed this with church that was in Russia. When the priest is coming out of the altar with the jasher, and he's coming back with it. We would call it the holy pirouette.
In the fear of God and faith and love around here.
It's like, what?
Because the priest, he probably had nobody go to confession, so he didn't think anybody was going to go to communion. And there are some really bad practice. I mean, that's bad practice in itself. There's an even worse practice, which if I was this bishop, I would suspend the priest from a flagpole, would be to do a dry liturgy. No bread, no wine.
What is
and no prayers.
Is you call that a liturgy?
Well, no, it's kind of let us pretend.
Why would you do that?
What would you even do in that?
Because, well, he figured if nobody else was going to go to communion, he wasn't going to either. So,
wow.
Why put all that work if nobody's going to
Defies the whole purpose of the liturgy.
Well, of course, it's ridiculous, quite frankly, I think any priest who would do that should get disciplined severely. But it's stupid things like that some of these practices lead to if the priest knows that nobody else is going to go to communion. And so, but the practice of infrequent communion started way back. This is like the 6th century, 7th century, when people started staying away from the chalice, and they thought that they're not worthy to go to communion, or they don't want to go to all the work to do or they had some kind of penance, the heavy-duty penance laid on them. The penitential discipline was strongly enforced in the early centuries. That's when it was written. And it didn't last very long because it was so totally impractical. And it scared people away from the church.
Exactly. It works the opposite way.
Yeah.
This is exactly how it works.
Yeah.
Because instead of encouraging you to prepare yourself and purify yourself to be there more frequently, it pushes you away.
Right, exactly.
What about the old believers? They had the same tradition?
No, that's 17th century. I'm talking about 7th century. There's a whole lot of difference in that 1,000 years.
But this is happening today.
And it's happening today
Yeah.
because of the printing press and the availability of books such as the Examologatarian of St. Nicodemus the Hagurite, which is, on one hand, it's a great book. On the other hand, if you have, some idiot young priest who thinks that he's, God's gift to the church and decides that he's going to start applying the canons strictly according to, by the rule, which is not what the canons are for in the first place, who doesn't understand anything, he's going to do all sorts of things and lay all sorts of heavy penances on people and scare them away from the church. And this is a real problem. It's a problem, especially in the Greek monasteries in this country and in Greece. The Russians, that became a bit of a problem in Russia, but I think it was rather nipped in the bud.
Romanians do that too. They sort of discourage people from communing frequently.
Well, that's basically, I think, more about the old tradition than it is, or the old custom. As Saint Basil the Great said, there's nothing worse than a bad old custom. Frequent communion is obviously what the liturgy expects, and for Orthodox Christians, what the canons expect, and what the liturgy is, how it's written. It expects that if you're there, you're going to go to communion, and that's it. Now, there's preparation for communion and a discipline of life and prayers and things like that. And we need to do those, and that's good. But the whole presumption is that people are going to be living a mindful and intentional Christian life. So you're going to keep the fasts. You're going to celebrate the feasts. You're going to be aware of the fasting days of Wednesday and Friday. You're going to you're not going to go out and get drunk and go to bars and pick up
girls
dates. Well, then you've got a mixed company. So girls, boys, or otherwise. Of course, these days it's otherwise. And
but this is exactly the point, political life. When you have the intent of going frequently, the whole mindset during the week changes.
Right.
Because it's okay, I've got to behave in a sense, but it helps you get discipline on a regular basis. It's
an encouragement, and eventually we begin to live from Eucharist to Eucharist, especially from Sunday to Sunday. Hopefully, thirsting for communion.
Exactly.
Not being able to wait until we can go the next time to receive communion, and I think that's the real. The best attitude to have. Now in the monasteries, of course, they still. I can't imagine being in a monastery and going to communion a couple times a year. I just can't imagine it.
I was going to ask you about that.
But bad old customs are bad old customs, and my guess is that when that happened, those monasteries were not very fruitful. I would bet. There probably were some despite that. But you know, the quality of the spiritual life and frequency of communion, I would think, would be in sync with one another. You know, and there are times that it's up and times that it's down, but you know, when people aren't receiving communion, I think also their spiritual life is probably not so good. But you especially in the monastic life, you see the absolute centrality of the Eucharist. St. Basil advised people to go 4 times a week: Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday. The day before it was a fast day. In monasteries, Mondays are fast days as well. So Monday, Wednesday, Friday are fast days. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, you have a fast day before. So people are preparing for communion. And then Sunday is Sunday. Yeah.
Would you fast on Saturday in the monastery?
The Greeks do. It's uncanonical.
So, like, what would they? What kind of fast would the Greeks put in place? That's uncanonical.
Typical Wednesday, Friday fast.
Oh, okay. It's uncanonical because it's not.
Well, it's forbidden to fast on Sunday.
Or Saturday.
On Saturday, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It's a Latinism.
No,
We don't fast on Saturday. We don't.
Fasting from meat, because that's very common too.
Right.
On a Saturday.
Oh yeah.
Is that more acceptable, or?
I mean, it's a nice pious practice, but it's not really within the. It's not really within the spirit of the canon.
Yeah. I had a tough time when I was talking to some Greeks. I'm like, for fasting on Saturday. I'm like, you know, are you fasting on Saturday? You know, we're about to go on Sunday. I'm like, no, I'm not fasting. It's not, you know. I basically said, you know, we're gonna need to on Saturday.
Yeah. The thing is, when you're in Rome, do as the Romans. When you're on Athos, do as the Athenites. You know.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are some strange traditions too. Like, for instance, even when you're sitting at the table, one day I got a gentle because you are not supposed to pick up the water before somebody's give you the sign to pick up the water, even the time that you're eating.
Yeah, that's an Athenite thing.
That's an Athenite thing.
You're not supposed to drink water or drink anything before they have a series of bells during the meal. It's all regulated. Everything gets. In some practices, everything gets regulated. Well, the Russians are much more casual.
But the idea of using separation, you know, of using precluding somebody from going to communion as a form of punishment, like separating them from communion with God as a form of punishment, to me is appalling. I mean, it's horrible.
Well, it is. On the other hand, part of what it is also is that if somebody has sinned in an excommunicable offense, that means that they have separated themselves from God, and they need time to restore themselves to communion with God.
Yeah, that I agree 100%.
And so that's what the idea of those penances are, is that you're cut off from receiving communion for a certain time because you need that amount of time to prepare to go to communion.
To truly repent.
To truly repent and to really focus on it. So it's not a bad thing if you're given a penance. But you need to make sure. But the father confessor needs to make sure that the penance is working and not backfiring, because sometimes it can create a total backfire and working in exactly the wrong way and create more problems than it solved. So the other thing that's really important when somebody has a long penance is that they keep going to confession during that time. not thinking, oh well, now I've got a vacation from from the discipline of the church for a while. No, doesn't work like that. But what's important is that if there's a penance, if you have some kind of serious fall, and your father confessor says, okay, no communion for 3 months. That means you need to be in church every Sunday and Saturday night, of course. You need to be reading the prayers. You need to be preparing for Holy Communion, and going to confession on a regular basis, and trying to get your spiritual life back in order.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Each case is a case.
Right. So. Okay. So basically, started out the discussion. I mean, the intention of the discussion is talking about preparation for the liturgy and moving into the proskomedia. And so, so you have to take into account, for example, at least as a priest, how many people you think are going to be receiving communion when you decide when you're doing proskomedia. Because I was quite shocked on Sunday down in Georgia. Here we were having this big celebration, right? There was one bishop, there were three priests and 2 deacons, 6 clergy, and then there were, he didn't know how many people were going to come. Well, there were probably 100 people who came. And the lamb was like that, 1.5 inch cube. It's like, oh.
What'd you do then?
I guess everybody got a crumb, but not much, some priests like to only give just a little tiny crumb. I tend to like to give a more substantial piece when people receive communion. And I also like to receive a substantial piece when I receive communion. And then there's this thing with the deacons. Sometimes the priest receives the separately. Takes the communion, puts it in his hand, and then drinks from the chalice. Well, sometimes the deacons decide to fill the chalice all the way to the brim. And it's one thing, if it's one thing, if it's a teacup, but when you have this, this huge chalice, and you have to move it on the altar, and it's a millimeter below the.
So what happens if it spills, Rodrigo? Because I hear that you have to burn,
Well, no, you don't. But that's what the animate, part of what the animate is for. But it'll soak through. So you just have to be very careful.
Do you can you just take a sip from it first before you move it, or I don't know.
Well, it depends on where it's sitting on the altar.
That's true. I don't know. I feel like that's a tough situation. What would you do when you're really careful, I guess?
And it's not exactly the place to swear at the deacon, Basically, what I do when that happens is, move it very, very carefully, and then drink it down, so that when I give communion to the next person, because I have to pick up the chalice, it doesn't spill.
What happens if the chalice falls on the floor?
I don't even want to think.
Because I'm sure that there are cases in which
there's plenty of cases, yeah. Well, technically the carpet has to be cut out or removed.
What if it's a top floor? You can soak it up.
That's why it's good to have a marble floor. Yeah, or hardwood floor or something.
Marble actually absorbs, yeah.
Well, something that's not going to absorb into something. So it has to be pure bread. The procer has to be made in a way that so there's no bubbles, and so that the seal is clear, and preferably so that it's really heavy, thick bread. It's Russian style bread. It's not like French bread or something like that, which is airy and puffy inside. In the Greek church, sometimes they use bread like that, but they have a whole different method of dividing it for communion. And then the wine also has to be pure wine. You can't use brandy. You can't use anything. You can't use fortified wine. You can't use brandy or sherry or something like that, which has had other things mixed in. Some churches, especially in America, like to use Manischewitz. Well, Manischewitz is not kosher for the Orthodox liturgy.
We use it here, obviously. We use it here.
Well, not for the chalice, though.
Not for the chalice.
It's a great
Not for the chalice.
Yeah.
They only use that for the pivka.
Because Manischewitz is full of corn syrup.
Oh, really?
That's one of the reasons it tastes so bad.
That's why it's so sweet.
Yeah. Yeah, and it all tastes the same. It's mass produced. I mean, it's basically, Jewish Coca-Cola. Awful stuff.
Is that a preferred brand, like for the church?
No, it's cheap.
But does
That's
that
the
mean
whole point. It's
like
cheap.
a Concord grape? It's got to be sweet.
Actually, for the chalice, no, it doesn't have to be a Concord grape.
Okay.
Now, the preference is most people prefer sweet, though some people will use dry. Some places, in Georgia, they tend to use a drier wine. But then you get little kids who don't.
Right.
So for Sapinka, you can use
Sapinka, you can use anything.
You can use anything.
In Valon, they used to use berry wine for Zapivka.
What is a pivka?
That's the little wine and water that you drink after communion.
What's that all about? That was a very new thing when I started going to a Russian church.
Yeah, that's about washing communion down.
Oh, that's it. All
The
right.
Coptics
So you
do
don't-
that too.
Yeah, so you don't have anything left in your mouth.
So does it have to be wine, or can it be something else?
It can be grape juice. It
It
can
could be Coke
Water.
or water.
Be water.
Probably not Coke. That's a little too much. But the idea is that you wash. You make sure that there's nothing left in your mouth. And there's an ancient problem. There was an ancient problem, which is maybe where it came from. Is that people would receive communion and then put it into a little box or something and take it home. And sometimes they would use it for witchcraft.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, I heard that.
And of course, that's just
There are people that
unthinkable.
still do that, by the way.
What's that?
There are people that still do that. There is a cleanse, there are cleanse in, no, I'm not going to speak about the specific country.
Yeah, in Romania,
But they do.
undoubtedly. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's.
So is there more syncretism in Romania?
There's in the mountains of Greece and in Romania, probably Bulgaria.
Yeah,
In the kind of the inner Balkans.
the
And
Romans.
there's all sorts of things that go on there.
The Romans.
Yeah, the Romani.
The Romani. Yeah.
The Gypsies. The Gypsies are Orthodox.
Mm-hmm.
They're all Orthodox, for the most part. Yeah. I had a friend who was a priest. The Gypsies liked him. And so, they would have these wild, he had a parish in Chicago, and the Gypsies would all come, and there would be hundreds of people at baptisms or weddings or things like that. And the parties were just wild after that, which I don't think he minded at all. And they would give him lots of money. So,
But that's sort of, the practice is, what they practice is witchcraft, Vladika.
Yeah, some of them. Yeah, and then, the old religion never quite died in many places. So.
Because they call upon spirits to help them, read the future and things like this. This is all from the other side.
Yeah. There's a guy who wrote Mountain of Silence, Kyriakos Markides. Mountain of Silence it's a kind of a popular exposition of Orthodoxy.
Mm-hmm.
He was a professor of anthropology at the University in Maine. And his research, when he was doing his PhD, was on the what would you call them? Witch doctors in Cyprus.
Yeah.
In Cyprus. Yeah.
Well, here in the U.S., there was a case that Father George actually found out there was a specific person that was getting communion, putting in a piece of paper to witchcraft.
Yeah. 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 They do all sorts of other things like sacrifice animals and all sorts of strange things, but obviously the church doesn't exactly bless any of that, but rather strongly condemns it. But the old religion is the old religion. So people just never converted. So anyway, pure bread, pure wine. In the Greek church, as I said, they'll sometimes use bread, that's very puffy inside, lots, like French bread. But whereas in the Russian practice is when the priest is preparing communion, it's all chopped up into, cut up into nice little cubes and everything. It's all kind of neat. And, in the Greek practice, they don't do that. They just put the whole lamb into the chalice, and they put all of the particles into the chalice and give communion from those. Whereas that would give most Russian priests a heart attack, because they don't. They think that only the lamb has been consecrated and not all of the particles.
Mm-hmm. And there's huge chunks too. In the Greek.
In the Greek,
chunks.
yeah. Well, it depends on the priest, but yeah. And some of the Greeks give little tiny crumbs as well. But there's as many practices as there are clergy. But there are kind of more kind of local traditions of how things are done, and so, for example, in the Russian Church, just at the I was at the clergy conference in Jordanville. We had 76 for communion at the altar, 76 clergy. So that's a lot of pieces that you have to cut up and figure out how many there are. Not to mention however many laity there were going to be.
Wow.
At the
Can you have more than one disc, or
no, there's always only one lamb. Well,
you have
actually,
multiple chalices and just
there's only one discos. You can have multiple lambs on the discos. So if your prosper is only so large and you have 1,000 communicants, you're going to cut several lambs. Just put them all together. Also, the same thing with pre-sanctified. You consecrate as many lambs as you're going to need for that week.
And what if you sort of over provision? Can you over provision? You have like 10 chalices, and there are only enough people for 5. So half of it you have to consume right after the service? Everything?
Yeah. Of course, if there's 10 chalices, that means there's 10 priests.
Mm-hmm.
So so the priest may not have any communicants, but he'll have to consume the whole chalice.
And what if you run short? You have 5 chalices and people there would consume 10.
Well, if it's necessary to, if you're running short and you only have 5 chalices, but you needed 10, then people are going to get very small pieces of communion, and
So you just control the flow
you just control,
as you're watching them.
So what happens if the priest is allergic to alcohol?
Actually, that happens once in a while. Is that the priest will consume, he'll consume the Lord's body, and then either take a very tiny sip, or as an alcoholic, for example, will take a very tiny sip. There's also cases where they'll use, if the priest is an alcoholic, for example, and there's nobody else to consume the chalice, they'll use a very low alcohol wine, like 1 or 2%.
So if the priest takes a little sip, then what happens to the rest of the wine? If there's a lot left?
Then the deacon finishes it, or another priest takes care of it. But that priest probably wouldn't be able to serve alone. So
you cannot save it for the next day or the next service?
No.
Not even the cross one?
No, actually no. In the Orthodox Church, what we do is when we prepare reserved gifts, and that's usually on Holy Thursday, for the sick for the rest of the year, is that there may be a whole separate lamb consecrated, and then at the end of the liturgy, that's cut into very small pieces, and each one is intincted with a little bit of the Lord's blood, and then it's left to dry. In Russia, they have these little stove things, where it's like a candle, a candle or something, and you put it on a metal plate over the candle, and it heats it up and it becomes rock hard.
Yeah, because there is inside of the altar, there is a small sanctuary where you actually place the Holy Thursday, a piece of the Holy Thursday bread that stays there permanently, right?
No, there are relics inside the altar that are sealed in there when it's consecrated.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Now there is a Greek practice, an ancient Greek practice, that a particle from the first Eucharist will be reserved on the altar.
Because Father George used to do that.
Yeah.
He told me that, it stays there, it's that sort of the living body of Christ that stays permanently in the altar.
Yeah, I think quite frankly that's not in the books, by the way. I think that's a custom,
Tradition.
or tradition rather than a central. It's not part of the service or anything like that.
And where is he kept? Right on the altar table?
It's in a little
metal box.
Little box on the altar table.
That has some places
Not
have
the
like this
tabernacle?
fancy.
Or in the tabernacle.
Yeah.
Yeah, the tabernacle.
That's correct though. If it's in the tabernacle, is it?
Well, it would be correct, yeah. Just so it doesn't get mixed up with the gifts for the sick, because that's primarily what the tabernacle is for. It's for the gifts for the sick.
Oh. So you also have relics in there?
Not in the tabernacle. No, the relics are an altar table. Has 5 legs. There's a leg in the center, and in the top of the center leg, it's hollowed out. There's space for a little box for relics to be sealed inside of it when before the top is put on. Because the ceremony of consecrating an altar includes the sealing of the relics into the altar, and then putting the top on. And that's why this is the Russian tradition. And so one of the things that you'll find, I would bet you'd find them underneath this altar here, is that there are some big rocks.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because the rocks were used to pound the pegs into that hold the top onto the legs of the altar. So the relics can't be accessed. They're sealed, and they're sealed with beeswax and with mastic and in a box in the structure of the altar table itself. And then the top is put on, and then it's washed with holy water. It's prismated, and then it's vested, and then it's bound with a cord.
And what you have on top of the table when you are actually consecrating the chalice, that is that cloth that is embroidered, right? That how is it called?
Well, no. Then there's a vestment that goes on top. You know, the kind of regular vestments for the altar, right? The colored cloth. Mm-hmm. Then there's the antimension, which is it has an image of Christ in the tomb.
Yeah, that's
with the authorization from the bishop to serve the liturgy.
That's the one.
And that's what the gifts are put on when they're brought in at the great entrance, and that's the one thing that's absolutely necessary. You don't have to have a consecrated altar, because there are relics sewn into the antimension. And antimension means instead of the table. Okay. So
there are relics in that course?
There are relics in it, yeah.
So what
and
relics
it's consecrated with prism. What's that?
What relics do we have here?
I don't remember. There's hundreds of relics in the church here.
Zadika, if it helps, I have a picture. I happen to have a picture of an altar that doesn't have any of the coverings on it. It was right before it was consecrated. If you want to pass it around.
Okay.
That might help some folks understand. You see what I mean? That here's the fifth leg in the middle.
Yeah.
And it's hollowed out from the top.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Very nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Antimension.
Yep.
Yep. I happen to remember that I had that picture, and I took one just to.
Which church is that?
I was a Ukrainian Orthodox church in, I think it was Bel Air, sort of kind of near Baltimore, northeast Baltimore. That was about February this year.
Yeah.
But I never got to see one that was like that before, so I kind of tried to take real careful notes as to what was happening during the service.
Yeah.
Because then they like nail the top of it on. And
well, they're pegs. There are no nails.
no, oh, they're with pegs?
Those
Okay.
pegs, yeah. There are no nails in an altar table.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So.
I feel like that's one of the rarer pictures I could find.
Yeah.
Explain.
So, like, if you are in a prison cell and you don't have an antimension, and you're celebrating, you're sort of improvising to celebrate.
Well, in a prison cell, that's an extraordinary circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
In Solid-Key, in the prison for clergy, they would have somebody lay down, and they would serve on their chest.
Wow.
Because they were living martyrs, and the person would soon be dead anyway. So.
Oh, Vadika, how beautiful!
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, what a fine godly way to not.
In the Ethiopian church, instead they don't have an antimension. They have a tablet. It's called the Ark, and which is supposed to be a symbolic of the Ark of the Covenant. And so at some point in the past, they actually would serve the Eucharist on top of the Ark of the Covenant.
Wow.
which is a pretty amazing concept. So, anyway, so if you have a church that has a properly set up altar, and you have an altar table like that that's been consecrated, consecration of a church is an amazing service, absolutely amazing. I mean, the bishop calls down the presence of God to abide in that place forever until the second coming, you know, and it's an amazing thing, and for the Spirit to fill the temple as it filled the temple of
So what happens if that church is like no longer being used and they have to move out? I'm kind of citing out an example of that.
Well, I mean, there are cases like that. If it's a consecrated temple, then we would say that the angel of that altar remains there. When I was the monastery we had in Point Reyes, the diocese decided that when we moved, that they would sell the property and move the church. And so they tore down the church. You know, I carried out the altar table. That was wild, to say the least. Then they took down the building, but you would go back to the place, and the foundation was still there, and you could tell where the altar table was, and it still had a presence.
And there's this whole new practice now, I don't know if you've seen the trend in which they are real estate agents, and they are converting churches into homes.
Yeah, well, Protestant churches, they're not. I mean, there's no concept of a consecration of a church for Protestants.
But it can happen to any church. It's not only Protestant.
Not generally Orthodox temples. And one of the things is Orthodox churches are not consecrated unless it's likely they're going to stay there permanently.
I mean, I'm just talking about one of the churches that recently moved from very close by and then went elsewhere.
The one across the street?
How about that one? Yeah.
Yeah.
What happened there? Like, how was that at all canonical? What they did?
We won't go there.
We won't go there. Okay.
No, it's never a good thing. One of the even worse things, it's a really scary thing, is on the south side of Chicago, there's this huge old Greek church. And you can tell it was a Greek Orthodox church. You know, I mean, huge dome, you know, the whole cruciform. And instead of the cross, there's the star and crescent. And they sold it to the black Muslims.
What about something like the Hagia Sophia? I mean, that's a much more prominent example.
Yeah.
So what's being done?
It's still a church.
It still has a consecrated
still,
altar. I mean, is
it
it
has no consecrated altar, obviously. Well, the altar's long gone. It's probably sitting in Venice.
Okay.
Actually.
Okay.
But
There's still presence still in that church.
Yeah.
There is.
Yeah, there were places that that the altar was actually converted into a bar.
oh yeah. Oh, one of the most horrible things to see in Russia when I lived there were these vandalized vacant churches, or the ones that had been converted into warehouses, bars, movie theaters. There was one that was converted into an ice rink. You know, a huge 5-domed Russian church. You know, you could see the iconography peeking through the whitewash. It was awful. Could you imagine taking your kid to go ice skating in the building like that? So, anyway, so we talked about the bread. We talked about the wine. We talked about for the Eucharist you need an antimensium, which has the bishop's signature, which authorizes this, the Eucharist. Actually, in some of the Russian gulags, they would have prisoners would have little tiny antimencia that they would hide. Just like a size of a scrap of cloth or a business card or something like that.
You know what? I never asked Father George about that. I should have. I bet you he had some way of improvising this.
Yeah, I'm sure they did.
Well, he was in a solitary.
And so, and obviously it's better if you've got a regular church set up. So you need a chalice and a discos, we call it a discos, with the star cover, and the spear and the spoon, then the various chalice veils and things like that.
What is this star cover?
The star cover is basically there to keep the cover from actually touching the bread and the wine, the bread of the offering, the lamb.
What does it look like? I have never seen one.
Maria, I'd like to take you to Hillwood. They've got some on view there.
What
The
is it?
museum, Hillwood Museum.
Oh, that? Very good.
I'll take you there.
Please. Yeah, let's do it.
Actually, there's one right here.
Oh, I
Oh,
see.
yes. Oh, yes.
Okay.
I see.
Now,
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a teeny one.
it's a small.
Yeah.
That's a good drawing, Vandika. Good perspective.
No, then the disco stands.
Uh-huh.
So, with the proscomedia, when if you have everything that you need, you got the priest cuts up a lamb. Of course, from the prosra, the prosra would be with the seal like that. So Okay. So for a Greek loaf, it's like that. You have these seals with that, right? That's what each of these are. Then this one here is actually, you aim to take out, and this is what's used for the lamb, and it's the center part of the prospero. You basically cut all the way through, and with the formula, as a sheep led to the slaughter, or a blameless lamb before its shears is dumb, so he opens not his mouth. In his humiliation, his judgment is taken away. Who shall declare his generation? For his life is taken up from the earth. And then you either bend these to the side, and you cut the prospero out so you've got a little cube.
So you take the whole center part out?
Yep. And that becomes a lamb. And then it's cut almost to the seal, but not quite. With the formula, sacrificed is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, for the life of the world and for its salvation. And it's placed here in the center. And then the wine and the water are poured into the chalice, wine mixed with a little bit of water. The priest reaches around and pierces the side of the bread with a spear, and says, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came forth blood and water. He who has seen it is borne witness, and his witness is true. The deacon pours the wine and the water into the chalice. The priest says, blessed is the union of thy holy things, always known ever into ages of ages. Then comes particles for the Mother of God. And then for the 9 ranks, St. John the Baptist, the prophets, the apostles, hierarchs, martyrs, monastics, unmercenaries, saints of the day, and the saint whose liturgy you're celebrating. Then for the living, for the bishops, for the emperor, or civil authorities, and for the departed. So you have a whole little icon of the church in bread. You've all seen that, right? Okay.
So there is no
Yeah.
particle,
No.
no particle for the patriarchs? Ah.
You only actually, unless you're a primate, you only commemorate your own patriarch, your own patriarch, and your own hierarchy. So, for example, here I would commemorate Patriarch Kirill, Metropolitan Jonah.
I'm talking about like the hierarchies, like the 9 pieces on the other side, like the patriarchs, because like during the prayer to make the coliver, we call upon but it's a different type of hierarchy, cherubims, seraphims,
That's the 9 ranks of angels.
Yeah, the patriarchs, like the patriarchs that have already passed away. not the ones that are here.
Well, yeah. That actually the formula for the departed is for all the Holy Orthodox patriarchs and pious kings and queens and so forth. Except in the OCA book, they don't do the kings and queens.
What do they do instead? I don't.
So the formula for the living is, remember, O Master, who lovest mankind, the whole episcopate of the Orthodox Church, our patriarch, our metropolitan, our bishop, archbishop, the honorable priesthood, the diaconate of Christ, the whole priestly and monastic order, our brethren, the concelebrating priests and deacons, and all our brotherhood, which thou hast called into thy communion through thy compassions, O gracious Master. Then for the second particle, remember, O Lord our God, protected land and its Orthodox people, which would otherwise be the emperor. And then for the departed, remember in blessed memory and for the remission of sins of the most holy patriarchs, bishops, priests, deacons, and all monastics, of all Orthodox and God-fearing rulers, and of all blessed founders of this holy church. So it's a whole icon of bread in the proscomedia. And then particles are put with the living or with or the departed, depending on who they are.
Where are the particles coming from, particularly?
Those would come in a typical liturgy from here and from here. Now in the Russian, so for example, the particles for the living would be taken from here by the priest for his own commemorations, for the departed, for his own commemorations. But then, in the Russian tradition, with the offering of all of the little prosphors, they would be taken from those prosphors.
I see.
Either individually or kind of symbolically. It's mostly symbolically. Usually there's only one or two particles taken out.
Yeah.
Because there are so many. And the reality is that the altar servers read the books.
Yeah, because there are so many names.
Because there's so many names,
you would stay there the whole day to wait for
stacks and stacks of books.
Yeah.
Although actually for the Slavonic liturgy, Father Victor reads huge numbers of books. He camps out in the sacristy during the English liturgy and reads the commemorations.
So like the particles, Vladika, that goes into the chalice, and the particles that we receive at the end, like when they have the platter, they are all from different. They have nothing to do with it's not prosper really, from the lamb, what we bring home.
Well, if you're getting the little prosperettes, no.
No.
Yeah, but I mean they've had a particle taken out. They've had two. They have one large chunk that's taken out, and that's given to people after they receive communion.
So that is the one after, in that platter.
And then and if you'll notice, there's a couple little particles taken out as well, and those went on the chalice. And at the end of the liturgy, all the particles, including the Mother of God, the saints, and the living and the dead, are all put into the chalice with the formula, "Wash away, O Lord, the sins of all those remembered here by the blood, by thy precious blood."
How about what is left from the loaf?
From communion?
From which you took those particles from?
Oh, from the prosper itself. Well, that's cut up and distributed as antidote. But in a church like this, where there are multiple loaves used for antidote, and it's all blessed.
How do you end up with a triangle? You cut like the square and then you cut it in half?
No, you cut it in at an angle, like this, and then a third.
Oh.
You
What does it
mentioned
have to be?
seals
Mm-hmm.
any number of times. What constitutes a seal? What do you mean by a seal?
When you come on Friday, I'll show you. It's a stamp.
Oh, okay.
It's a stamp. It has
okay.
has a seal carved into it that's stamped into the bread, and so it's the seal with this.
What you see on top
A
of the
seal.
crossbar.
Okay, I'm
Yeah.
thinking of sealing the loaf.
No, it's
Okay, that's what's wrong.
yeah.
The same concept of the seal from the king, right? From the ring.
Yeah,
You have the
exactly.
seal, you have the large seal.
And that goes back. That goes way back. There was actually in the temple the loaves for the bread of the presence, the showbread, had a seal stamped onto it.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's 3,000 years old or more.
I have a picture of one, Liturgy.
Okay.
Pass it around.
Oh, very good. Yeah. And they're quite expensive too because they're hand carved, right?
Some of them are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some are machine made.
Yeah, this
Oh,
is.
they have machine made too. None of
That's
that.
the Greek one.
Yeah, this is. Yeah, and it's plastic. It's cast.
Oh.
Well, I'm just trying to get an example.
They look the same. So they have the
It
same.
looks the
Yeah.
same.
Yeah.
Now they
Wooden ones
now
are
they have
carved.
now they have a thing where they have a seal that's embedded into the bottom of a pan,
Uh-oh.
and so you press the bread into the pan, and it's baked upside down.
Oh, that's an
And,
idea.
and so you turn it over and take the pan away, and you got the seal impressed into the.
Is that canonical, Liturgy? No. Okay.
Yeah.
It works.
It works.
Yeah.
I've, in a pinch, I've used a potato.
Okay.
Carved a seal into a potato, making prosper.
Now, Politica, when do you use the star? Because you really you did a good job with the star there.
Yeah, after all the commemorations are made before the liturgy starts, then the gifts are covered, and so the first thing you put over the gifts is the star, and the formula is the star came and stood over the place where the young child was.
Wow.
And the deacon says, "Let us pray to the Lord," and then you get the cover. The kind of four-sided cover like those down there, and you put it on top of the discos, on top of the star, and you say the psalm, "The Lord reigns, he is robed in majesty, the Lord is robed, he is girded with strength, he has established the world, it shall never be moved. Thy throne is established from of old, thou art from everlasting. The floods have lifted up, O God, the floods have lifted up their voice, the floods have lifted up their roaring. Mighty than the thunder, many waters, mighty than the waves of the sea. The Lord on high is mighty, thy decrees are very sure. Holiness befits thy house, O Lord, forevermore." Okay, that's for that cover. And then you put the cover on the chalice, same kind of cover. Although in some places it's just a square, it doesn't have the four sides. I think the Romanians actually use something like that. And the formula is, "Thy virtue has covered the heavens, O Christ, and the earth is full of thy praise." And then the air, which is large rectangular cloth, goes over the top of it, and AER, air, and covers with the formula, "Cover us with the shelter of thy wings, drive away from us every foe and adversary, give peace to our lives, O Lord. Have mercy on us and on thy world, and save our souls, for thou art good and lovest mankind." And then, in the meantime, the deacon or the server is holding the censer, and each of these things, the star and the covers, are censed before they're put on. And then the priest takes the censer and censes the gifts. Blessed is our God, who is thus well pleased, glory to thee. The deacon replies, always now and ever into ages of ages, 3 times. And then there's this prayer from the Liturgy of St. James. For the precious gifts now offered, let us pray to the Lord. O God, our God, who did send the heavenly bread, the food of the whole world, our Lord Jesus Christ, to be our Savior, Redeemer, and Benefactor, blessing and sanctifying us, bless this offering accepted upon thy heavenly altar. Remember those who offered it and those for whom it was offered, for thou art good and lovest mankind. Preserve us blameless in the celebration of thy divine mysteries, for sanctified and glorified is thy most honorable, majestic name, of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, now and ever, to ages of ages. Amen. So that's proscomedia.
So what is the meaning? I was too in awe of the meaning of the star, because I never even thought about that. That is so wonderful. What is the meaning of the air? A-E-R?
A-E-R, the air.
What is it representing?
Well, initially, the air had the image of Christ in the tomb on it. It was the epitaphios, the plashenitsa. And the air is also used at ordinations, especially the ordination to a priest, where the priest is covered by the air. Actually, in the great entrance when the gifts are brought in, the priest is last. The guy to be ordained a priest, the deacon to be ordained a priest, has the air put over his head.
Yeah.
Because the air is covers the offering.
Is that the one that the priests shake when you're praying? Oh.
Yeah, but the air is the cover, and it signifies that there is this offering that is being made.
So in English it's not A-I-R.
It's A-E-R.
Because it's Vozdukh. In Russian it's air.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's strange.
Well, I don't know why.
That's weird.
Air.
Maybe it's an acronym for something.
What's that?
An acronym?
No. No, we don't use acronyms generally in the church. Except for jurisdictions.
Yeah.
But
So it's the star of the bird. What is it for?
yeah, now it's also very practical. Well, it's kind of practical because some of them are more stable than others, and when they're not stable, it's a pain.
Oh yeah, because you got
I mean, you've all seen where the deacon has come out with the and it all collapses.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not consecrated. The bread is not consecrated yet, but still, I mean, it's holy. It's been offered or being offered. And,
Halfway through.
right. So that's all the preparation for the liturgy, and then after that starts, the liturgy actually can start. After that prayer, O God, our God, who sent on the heavenly bread, there's a dismissal, and then the deacon senses the altar and the offering, and it says, "In the tomb with the body, and in hell with the soul, in paradise with the thief, and on the throne with the Father and the Holy Spirit, was thou, boundless Christ, filling all things." One of the Apostle hymns. One of the things that you find stuck into the liturgy are remnants of some of the old symbolic interpretations of the liturgy, which are kind of second or third level. I mean, they're pious interpretations. And it came from a time when people, weren't receiving communion. They didn't understand what was being said. In the Greek church, the liturgy is in 4th century Greek. Okay.
Can you read the last sentence again, Radhika, please?
In the tomb with the body?
Yeah.
It's one of the Apostle hymns. In the tomb with the body, and in hell with the soul, in paradise with the thief, and on the throne with the Father and the Holy Spirit, was thou, boundless Christ, filling all things.
Okay.
Yeah. So there were symbolic interpretations of the liturgy that where people could follow along in their little books with these symbolic interpretations, which had, this was the idea, the liturgy is a depiction of the life of Jesus. No, it's not, in reality. That's a nice pious interpretation, but it has nothing to do with the liturgy, in reality. And some of these got very, very far away from what the actual text itself says. And the prime thing about the liturgy is, what does the text itself say? And how does it fit in relation to the text of the Holy Scriptures? So we need to understand the liturgy on its own terms and not in terms of, some of these pious interpretations.
Mm-hmm.
But that is it's another bad old custom. But that goes back to the 9th century, when there was St. Germanos of Constantinople wrote one of those. Gogol wrote one of those.
But thinking about it, even if you look into the symbolism of the artifacts that are used in there, you see the birth, you see the sacrifice. There are elements of the life, not the whole thing.
There are elements there, and it's important to remember that it is a commemoration of Christ and of his life and of his death.
Resurrection. Yeah.
And resurrection, but it's not a mystery play.
Yeah.
It's not a mystery play about the life of Jesus.
No. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
So, one of the icons that drives me nuts is when you have a picture of a discos with a star and a baby laying on the discos.
Oh, yeah.
It drives me nuts. It's like, no. No. It misses the point. Theologically problematic.
Yeah, I don't even see what it could represent.
Yeah, it's like the icon of the Trinity, the old man, the kid, and the bird. No. Now, you go to Jordanville, and you've got that all over the place. You've got it on the ceiling above the altar. It's the patronal icon for the monastery. I mean, it's uncanonical. It was condemned in the 17th century.
And you see God.
That's the problem.
All the way up.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm talking about.
But that is beautiful. I know we are not supposed to paint that. That is a very limited.
It's forbidden.
Yeah, I know it's forbidden. But let me tell you, Vadika, I was in awe, and I was, sort of not even off to ask. I have never seen this before. And the priest, we don't talk about it. He said, where does this icon from? I have never seen it. We don't talk about it. I was like, oops.
An old white guy sitting on a cloud with a long beard.
I've seen a lot of those.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost as bad as Jesus the Ukrainian, right? Blonde hair, blue-eyed,
Oh, the Catholic portrait Jesus.
No, he's Russian. Sorry.
Well, it depends on...
The Italians do that too. At the Renaissance, it's blue eyes, blonde.
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
But that's probably not what Jesus looked like.
Absolutely not. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, you should see when the Nestorians were in China, they had this depiction of Jesus, and that looks really, really different from what we think of Jesus as looking like.
In China?
Yeah, and they made it. It was like 1,000 years ago.
Chinese.
Yeah, he looks very Chinese.
Yeah.
And he is kind of the halo, but it's not really the same halo that we see.
Yeah, I
would
love to research that, the so-called Nestorian church in China.
Mm-hmm. What is the icon called, Vadika?
Here it is.
Colette was
I'll
writing
pass
a
it around.
book about the mystery behind that icon and why it's not appropriate.
This is Jesus.
Yeah, because technically nobody has ever seen God and you can't paint him or depict him.
Yeah, it looks very Chinese. Yeah.
back.
Can I see? Oh,
Yeah.
it disappeared.
I'd like to see too.
Well, maybe this is really
Ah, yes it is. Huh. And this is Jesus, huh?
Yeah.
7th century? He was
I think
638
so.
when the Tang Emperor...
I think it's around then, yeah.
Yeah, the Tang Emperor either converted or at least he accepted
No,
Christianity.
he said the principles were good, and he endorsed it.
Yeah.
Wow.
But the historians there had a lot of pressure, I read, to conform to, or to emphasize their similarities with Confucian and Taoist beliefs, even to the detriment of their doctrine. So that caused the problem.
Well, I think, and it's a really interesting thing. There's Eastern Syriac Christianity. I don't call them historians. I just call them Christians. The Christians in China, the Syriac Christians in China. That whole theological, it's the worldview of Saint Isaac the Syrian, and which actually comes out of the Vagrius in the 4th century, who was a disciple of the Cappadocian Fathers, and he kind of went off on his own trip, but he became one of the most important spiritual writers, and the Syriac great Syriac fathers like Saint Isaac the Syrian took and built on his thought. Well, that thought, that theological vision, became the heart of Sufism, and it also became, I believe, it was adopted by both Taoism and Buddhism, because it's the same terminology, it's the same categories, and they're slightly different, but God knows how many times that they've been translated into how many different languages, but it's the same concepts that are being used. And I think the so-called Nestorian monks, the Syriac monks who brought Christianity to China, and there were there were tens of millions of Christians in China in the end of the first millennium. There was something there that was really powerful. There was a metropolitan see in Kabul, Afghanistan. There was a metropolitan in Xi'an. There was a metropolitan in Tibet. You don't have metropolitan archbishops in villages. So it's very interesting. Have you read much about the Chinese?
I've started reading about the Syrian Church in the Church of the East in China and Central Asia.
Mm-hmm. Do you speak any read
No,
in China?
I can't.
Yeah, no.
A few words, maybe.
No, it's all ancient Chinese anyway.
Yeah.
But the Syriac is it's all a dead language. So that's fixed anyway. But if you learn the Syriac, what I'd love to do is follow the Silk Road, because all along the Silk Road are ancient monasteries, and some of their libraries are undoubtedly still intact.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Could you imagine?
wow.
And especially the further east you go. There's this one monastery in Xi'an, which was like the imperial capital at that time, and they thought it was a Confucian monastery, but then they started really looking at some of the symbols and things like that, and so there were crosses surrounded by dragons. It was very Chinese, but obviously very Christian. And they broke into a sealed library and found all these Christian texts.
Oh, is that where they found this? The stele?
Yeah, and there are all these stelae that
The monk Alopin.
Yeah, where they that record that the emperor, the Xi'an the emperor of the Tang dynasty accepted the Luminous religion to be preached in China.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, they are under very harsh persecution now. They're
No, they were wiped out in the 12th, 13th century.
There's no more.
no. But what I mean is Christianity.
Yeah,
Yeah?
but that's Western importation. It's, they wiped out all the Christians just in time for the Jesuits to get there. From the Portuguese.
Because even having Bibles is very bad. They're smuggling Bibles over there right now.
Oh yeah, it's horrible.
Yeah.
But there's an incredible history there that we don't even know about. Much of it.
Wow. So I did not know about the Silk Road with monasteries.
That's how it spread to China.
Wonder if any of the apostles ever went there, right?
Well, I read that Saint Thomas went to India.
Yeah, Thomas made it to India, but it was Adai and Mari that went to Mesopotamia, and the Syriac Church still uses their liturgy. Adai and Mari, they were of the 70, but of the 12, none of the 12 got further than that.
Well, Dick, is anything written at all in the literature in general about the 20-some years that, 27, that we don't know anything about Jesus' life?
No.
Nothing at all. Nowhere. Egypt, because
No, that's not likely that he went to India and became a guru. Or he did, or became a sadhu or something.
Well, as a Mormon, he came here on the 6th century, I think.
Yeah, well, some Presbyterian minister's imagination.
because the Holy Family did go to Egypt, right, after to escape.
Right, but that was like next door. Yeah, they could walk. They did.
They walked. They have no other choice.
Yeah. So. All right. Are we?
Well, that was amazing, Jacob. Very good. Because those are things that I see all the time, and I had no idea.
Yeah. Well, it's all the stuff that goes into the celebration of the liturgy. A lot of people don't know about.
Yeah, from my perspective, it gives me a lot more appreciation for knowing what is happening.
Yeah, it's kind of the priest's point of view. Well, it is the priest's point of view. Okay, are we? Next week, I have an engagement on Tuesday night, so that will not work. So until the next week.
Time for the homework.
Time for the homework. It is true and to bless the Theotokos of the blessed and most pure and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compared than the seraphim, who without corruption gave us birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify you. The blessing of the Lord be upon you, through his grace and love for mankind, always now and to the ages of ages. Amen.
Jesus,
Bless you.
Amen.